All right.
Everybody sat here and
Hear me out. Shut up.
I'm not going to shut up while
Get
you're
him
talking
out of
about
here.
that. Get me out of here.
There's a murderer in this room. He's sitting right there.
Danny Serafini did not shoot his in-laws.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Daniel Joseph Serafini, guilty.
Without a reason that is based on facts and circumstances, you have a sudden and unexpected event that results in confusion.
I interrupt you, so why do you keep interrupting me? I know you can judge. But
Okay, hear me out. I've heard enough of this narcissistic. You're a narcissist, and I'm not going to put this
It's
family
not like you're a
again.
narcissist because you're talking and you're going all...
Shut his microphone off.
And the woman you shared a child with that you supposedly cared about.
Brooks, you took my mother's life and tried to erase her from existence. For 10 years, I've lived with pain and anger and emptiness.
That Brian Cooper is guilty. And look at it. You need to look at him. You need to consider the enormity of what he did in this situation.
It started with family, trust, and familiar faces, and ended with prison cells. Christopher McCullough turned a visit to his parents' house into a deadly confrontation, while Craig Smith entered his aunt's home for money, an elderly woman who never walked out. They weren't strangers. They were people once trusted. But when the courtroom doors closed, the truth came out, and so did the consequences. Let's begin.
It was a life-threatening blow to the head to cause a deep brain bleed.
A family visit to a parent's home turned into a nightmare. A mother lost her life, a father was left hospitalized, and a young child witnessed something horrifying no young ones should ever have to see. In August 2023, Christopher McCullough went to his parents' home in Raleigh. His young son was also present. After a few minutes, a confrontation broke out between McCullough and his father, John. The situation quickly became ferocious, and McCullough attacked both of his parents. His mother, 75-year-old Mary McCullough, was beaten during the attack. She suffered fatal injuries and did not survive. John was also seriously injured and spent several days in the hospital. Tragically, McCullough's young son was there and witnessed the horrible attack. After the attack, investigators began piecing together what had happened inside the McCullough home. When police arrived, they found John and Mary McCullough badly injured. The scene immediately suggested that something horrible had taken place. Detectives documented the disturbing evidence, the injuries, and the signs of a struggle as they worked to reconstruct the moments before officers arrived. But there was another question. Where was Christopher? Investigators soon learned that he had left the house after the attack. He had taken his young son and the family pet and driven away in a vehicle. Detectives began tracing his movements. Surveillance footage later placed McCullough at a hotel with his son. The footage became another piece of the timeline investigators were building. Police also interviewed him after his arrest. During questioning, McCullough claimed he had gone to his parents' home because he believed they were hurting his son. He admitted striking his father, but said he could not fully remember what had happened afterwards. At times, he claimed he had blacked out. Then the investigation took a darker turn. Mary McCullough died several days after the attack. What began as an investigation into a brutal assault was now a homicide investigation. Detectives went back over the evidence, the statements, the surveillance footage, and McCullough's movements after leaving the house. They also uncovered an important piece of history between the family members. John McCullough had previously obtained a protective order against his son, alleging earlier threats. With Mary now dead, prosecutors built their case around what investigators had uncovered inside the home and what McCullough had done afterwards. The case eventually went before a Wake County jury. After around 7 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. McCullough was found guilty of first-degree murder in his mother's death, but he was found not guilty of attempting to murder his father and not guilty of larceny of a dog. During the trial, McCullough said he had been drinking heavily, taking substances, and had gone 6 days without sleep around the time of the attack. His defense argued that he had not intentionally killed his mother. His attorney said McCullough had gone to the house because he needed gas money, and that a confrontation with his father triggered a fight or flight response. But whatever began that day ended with a mother dead and a family permanently changed. On May 2, 2025, McCullough received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison for his mother's murder.
We, the jury, by unanimous verdict, find the defendant, Christopher Gilbert
McCullough to be guilty of first-degree murder on the basis of premeditation and deliberation.
However, he remained expressionless through the verdict. His father, John, spoke about Mary during the case, remembering how deeply she loved their son and how hard she had tried to help him. But the most painful impact was felt by the child who witnessed the attack. In a statement submitted on the child's behalf, his mother said he had watched someone he loved die that day. She said the experience changed him, leaving a sadness no child should have to carry. A family home became the setting for a devastating crime, and when the verdict came down, the sentence could never undo what that child had already seen. The next killer didn't lash out in a moment of panic. He planned every second of it, down to how he'd make his own wife disappear.
He nudged Anna, his wife. She didn't respond.
A New Year's Day that should have marked a fresh beginning ended with a woman disappearing from her own home. What followed was a chilling investigation, a missing body, and a barbaric murder. Their marriage had been falling apart long before Anna Walsh disappeared. Behind the walls of their home, their marriage was already undergoing strain. But on New Year's Day, the tension between Brian and Anna allegedly reached a deadly point. Brian killed Anna inside the house and hid the disturbing evidence in the basement, along with a damaged knife. As investigators searched for Anna, attention quickly turned toward her husband and uncovered a series of disturbing internet searches made by Brian. Investigators argued that the searches showed he had been thinking about how to kill someone and dispose of a body. Surveillance footage became another key piece of evidence. Investigators showed video of Brian purchasing cleaning supplies from local stores after Anna disappeared. During the investigation, Brian said he had found Anna dead in their bed after a New Year's Eve party and panicked. But the investigation told a different story. The evidence pointed away from an accident or panic and toward a killing that prosecutors said was deliberate and premeditated. The case eventually reached trial for the murder of Anna. Prosecutors faced a difficult reality. Anna's body had never been found. There was no grave, no autopsy, and no single piece of evidence that showed exactly how she died. Instead, the prosecution built its case by putting together everything Brian had done before and after her disappearance. The prosecutor said,
"Prove the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt."
Brian initially told investigators that she had left for Washington, D.C. because of an emergency involving her work. But detectives couldn't find evidence that Anna had ever made the trip. Prosecutors showed the jury searches involving dismemberment, cleaning, disposing of a body, and whether someone could be convicted of murder without the victim's body being recovered. They argued that the timing of those searches was significant because they were made around the time Anna disappeared. Cameras captured Brian visiting several stores after Anna was last seen. Prosecutors said he purchased items including a hacksaw, cutting tools, cleaning supplies, and a protective suit. Investigators later recovered bags of discarded items that they said connected Brian to the disappearance. Among those items were a hatchet, a hacksaw, cleaning products, a purse, boots, and Anna's COVID-19 vaccination card. Forensic testing provided another link. Investigators said Anna's DNA was found on several of the recovered items, while both Anna and Brian's DNA were detected on the protective suit. Brian's attorney argued that Anna may have died unexpectedly and that Brian panicked afterwards, choosing to conceal what had happened instead of contacting police. Brian didn't testify, and the defense ultimately called no witnesses. Prosecutors, however, argued that evidence showed that Brian had not simply panicked after an accident, but had deliberately tried to conceal his wife's death. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that Brian's troubled marriage and his access to Anna's life insurance policy, which was worth more than $1 million. His defense offered a different explanation, claiming he had found Anna dead after a New Year's Eve party and panicked. But the jury ultimately rejected that account. On December 18, 2025, Brian Walsh was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict came down, he remained frozen in his seat, showing no emotion. The judge also sentenced him to the maximum penalties on 2 additional charges: misleading a police investigation and improperly moving a human body. Those sentences were ordered to run consecutively to his life sentence. Massachusetts law automatically sends his murder case to the state Supreme Judicial Court for appeal. Anna's sister, Alexander Dmitrovic, spoke in court about the devastating impact of the loss. She said,
She was someone I grew up with, someone who knew me in ways no one else ever will.
She also said the family was left with an unbearable emptiness, while Anna's 3 young children would have to grow up without their mother. The judge also condemned the way Anna's remains were allegedly handled, describing Walsh's actions as barbaric and incomprehensible. Anna's body may never have been recovered, but after nearly 3 years, the courtroom delivered its answer. Brian Walsh will spend the rest of his life behind bars for the murder of his wife. The killer in the next case didn't pick up the phone himself, right after leaving 3 members of his own family dead.
This is without a doubt one of the most tragic cases that I have ever presided over.
A family home in Henrietta became the scene of a devastating attack. In a matter of minutes, 3 family members were fatally stabbed, and the man responsible would eventually receive 3 life sentences. On January 11, 2023, Raja Banahi went to his parents' home on Cathy Drive in Henrietta, New York, despite an order of protection that prohibited him from being there. Inside the home were his parents, Ali and Mastura Banahi, and his sister, Masuda. Banahi went into his father's bedroom and attacked him with a kitchen knife. Ali was bedridden and seriously ill at the time. Banahi stabbed him repeatedly, with the attack continuing until the knife broke off in his shoulder. When Mastura and Manuda came to Ali's defense, Banahi grabbed another knife from the kitchen and attacked them as well. Ali was stabbed more than 30 times in total. Banahi was still attacking his father when police arrived at the home. Ali and Mastura were already dead because of multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma. Masuda survived the initial attack, but had suffered severe injuries. She was rushed to Strong Memorial Hospital for emergency surgery, but she died from her injuries 17 days later. The investigation began immediately after police arrived. Banahi had called an emergency himself and told dispatchers that he had stabbed members of his family. He also said that he was washing evidence from his hands and that he had committed the killings. He was arrested at the scene. Investigators also learned that Banahi had previously assaulted his father and threatened to kill him. His father had an active order of protection against him when the killings occurred. In April 2026, the case went before Monroe County Court Judge Michael Dollinger in a 4-day bench trial. Instead of 12 jurors deciding Banahi's fate, Judge Dollinger would hear the evidence himself and determine whether Banahi was guilty of murdering his father, mother, and his sister. The defense focused on Banahi's mental health and his ability to understand his actions at the time of the killings. But after considering the evidence, Judge Dollinger reached his verdict on June 23, 2026. He found Banahi guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and aggravated criminal contempt. Prosecutors said Banahi's anger had repeatedly focused on his father. He blamed Ali for problems in his life, including financial difficulties and not having a place to live. During sentencing, however, Banahi blamed his family, claiming they had bullied him, and insisted that the killings were not motivated by rage. On July 28, 2026, Banahi, now 43, was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences for the murders. However, he didn't show any signs of remorse for the actions he did. He said,
"I did not stab my father 30 times. This was not a rage against my family. They were the ones that bullied me."
He also received a concurrent sentence of 2 to 4 years for aggravated criminal contempt. The maximum sentences brought the case to a close, but they could never undo the loss of 3 members of one family. Prosecutors said the surviving family members have been left devastated by the killings. Assistant District Attorney Patrick Gallagher told the court that the family had been completely torn apart. There was some sense of closure with the sentence, he said, but the family would never fully heal from what happened. A home that was supposed to be a place of safety became the setting for an attack that destroyed an entire family. And when the courtroom finally delivered its punishment, 3 lives were gone, while the survivors were left to carry the loss. The next case proves that a piece of paper can't stop a bullet. One day in court, the next day a mother was gone.
He grabbed the loaded shotgun he had brought with him. He forced Kiara to open the door, and then he murdered her. He shot her right through the head.
A woman was trying to move forward with her life, but one day before her death, her estranged husband was in court over an alleged assault against her. The next day, her children watched as their mother was killed. On October 5, 2022, 30-year-old Kiara Hudson was outside her car at the intersection of Shawnee and Richlawn Avenues in northeast Buffalo, New York. Her 3 young children, including an infant, were in the back seat. Hudson was wearing a bulletproof vest because she feared her estranged husband, Adam Benefield, would kill her following an alleged assault days earlier. But the vest did not protect her. Benefield shot Hudson in the head, killing her while her children were inside the car. After Hudson was killed, investigators arrested Benefield and built a case against him. He was originally charged with second-degree murder and 3 counts of endangering the welfare of a child. Investigators later secured a conviction for Hudson's murder. The case also brought attention to Benefield's violent history. He had previously served 15 years in prison for the armed kidnapping of 2 women, including an ex-girlfriend. Benefield's case eventually went to trial, and he was convicted of killing Hudson. The trial lasted 3 days. One of the most emotional moments came when Hudson's daughter took the witness stand. She had witnessed her mother's killing and testified against Benefield in court. Prosecutors argued that the evidence showed a deliberate murder committed in front of Hudson's children. The defense challenged the prosecution's case, but after hearing the evidence, the jury didn't take long to reach a decision. On November 20th, 2024, after roughly an hour of deliberation, the jury found Benefield guilty on all 5 counts: second-degree murder, aggravated criminal contempt, and 3 counts of endangering the welfare of a child. But the courtroom confrontation did not end with a guilty verdict. At Benefield's December sentencing hearing, he began challenging the proceedings and complained about the makeup of the jury, including its harmful ideas composition. He also argued that the case had been handled unlawfully and continued trying to address the court despite the judge ordering him to stop. Judge M. William Baller eventually ordered Benefield removed from the courtroom. The judge then proceeded with the sentencing. The prosecution's case centered on the deadly conflict between Benefield and his estranged wife. Just 1 day before the murder, Hudson had been involved in a court case concerning an alleged assault by Benefield. Although an order of protection was issued, Benefield was released. The following day, Hudson was dead. And finally, Benefield was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for Hudson's murder. The sentence ensured that he would spend decades behind bars for taking her life. Instead of showing any remorse, he said,
I'm here because I don't want to be here. I'm forced to be here to fight these charges.
Hudson's mother, Tammy, spoke in court about everything her daughter would never get to experience. She said Kiara would never see her son take his first steps, hear his first words, or watch him walk into school for the first time. Her message was simple: Benefield should never be allowed to walk free again. 3 children lost their mother that day, and for them, the sentence could never replace the person they lost. The next killer didn't strike in an instant. He left a family searching for answers for over a decade, with nothing but an empty car on the side of the road.
Put a pile, and I'll light a little piece of it on fire, and then that way I don't have a huge fire.
A mother of 5 vanished in the middle of the night. Days later, her abandoned car became the first clue in a mystery that kept her family searching for answers for years. More than a decade later, the case finally reached a courtroom, but a mother was still missing. On July 3, 2015, 35-year-old Crystal Rogers disappeared from her home in Bardstown, Kentucky. At the time, Rogers was living with her boyfriend, Brooks Houck, their 2-year-old son, and her other children. Houck and Crystal had been at home that night, playing games on her phone before he went to bed. When he woke up the next morning, she was gone. Her family became alarmed after they couldn't reach her. 2 days later, on July 5th, Crystal's 2007 Chevrolet Impala was discovered abandoned near mile marker 14 of the Bluegrass Parkway. One of its tires was flat. But several personal items were still inside. Her keys were in the ignition, while her purse and cell phone remained inside the vehicle. Crystal herself was nowhere to be found. Her mother, Sherry Ballard, officially reported her missing that same day. Investigators quickly began looking into the people closest to Crystal. Her family publicly questioned whether Brooks Houck knew more than he was saying. On July 8th, Houck was questioned by the Nelson County Sheriff's Office. His brother, Nick Houck, who was a Bardstown police officer, called during the interview and reportedly told Brooks not to speak with investigators. That raised further questions. Investigators later focused on a white Buick that had reportedly been at the Houck family farm around the time Crystal disappeared. Authorities suspected the vehicle may have been used to dispose of evidence, although Crystal's remains were never found. Searches continued for years. Authorities even offered a $100,000 reward for information that could help solve the case. After years of unanswered questions, the case finally reached trial in 2025. Prosecutors argued that Brooks Houck was responsible for Crystal Rogers' death and that Joseph Lawson helped him cover it up. Their case relied heavily on digital evidence, cell phone records, surveillance footage, and the movements of the men around the time Crystal disappeared. Then, in September 2023, Joseph Lawson was indicted on charges connected to a murder conspiracy and evidence tampering. A month later, Brooks Houck was arrested and charged with Crystal's murder. In December 2023, Joseph Lawson's father, Steve Lawson, was also arrested and indicted on conspiracy charges. The case finally moved toward trial. The exact motive for Crystal's killing remained unclear. Prosecutors, however, connected Houck and the Lawson men to a conspiracy surrounding her disappearance and the destruction or concealment of evidence. Another disturbing connection emerged from the investigation. 16 months after Crystal disappeared, her father, Tommy Ballard, was shot and killed while hunting on his property with Crystal's 12-year-old son. Authorities classified Tommy's death as a homicide. The case remained unsolved, though investigators later recovered a firearm that prosecutors said could be connected to his killing. The long-running case finally produced convictions in 2025. Steve Lawson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence and received 17 years in prison. In July 2025, Brooks Houck was found guilty of Crystal Rogers' murder and complicity in tampering with physical evidence. Joseph Lawson was also convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. On September 17, 2025, Houck was sentenced to life in prison, while Joseph Lawson received 25 years in prison. However, both remained motionless as the verdict was read. Even Crystal's mother said to Houck's,
Never once have I seen you shed one tear, not one tear.
For more than a decade, Crystal's family has lived without knowing where she is or what happened to her. Someone from her family said,
She is not gone. She is everywhere. She is always guiding us, inspiring us, and reminding us to stand strong, even in the face of the unimaginable loss.
Her children grew up without their mother, while investigators continued searching for the evidence needed to bring the case to court. The convictions finally brought accountability, but not the answer Crystal's family had waited years to hear. This next killer didn't break down a door. He let himself in and waited for his family to come home.
He thought he had gotten away with murder. He thought that he would be cashing out my parents' estate with his wife in the months afterwards.
A peaceful Lake Tahoe home became the scene of a deadly ambush. A retired couple returned from a family boating trip, unaware that someone was already waiting inside. Minutes later, one was dead, another was fighting to survive, and the truth would take years to surface. On June 5, 2021, former Major League Baseball pitcher Dan Serafini broke into the Lake Tahoe area home of his in-laws, Robert Gary Spohr and Wendy Wood. The couple had been out on a boating trip with their grandson and daughter, Erin Spohr, who was Serafini's wife. But while they were away, Serafini entered the home and waited. When Robert and Wendy returned, Serafini allegedly attacked them with a firearm. Robert Spohr was shot and killed. Wendy was shot twice in the head and left inside the home. Despite her devastating injuries, Wendy survived the attack. She managed to escape the house and get herself to safety. Robert was killed in an execution-style attack. Wendy survived after being shot twice in the head, but the injuries left lasting scars on her life. 2 years later, in 2023, she passed away. The case remained unsolved for more than 2 years. Then, in late 2023, authorities arrested Serafini in connection with the shootings. They also arrested Samantha Scott as Serafini's nanny-turned-lover. Daniel Serafini's trial brought a 2-year-old mystery into the courtroom. Prosecutors told jurors that Serafini was the masked gunman who entered his in-laws' Lake Tahoe home and opened fire. Gary Spohr was killed, while Wendy Wood survived despite being shot. The prosecution presented cell phone records, surveillance footage, messages, and testimony they said connected him to the attack. A key witness, Samantha, admitted helping Serafini before and after the shooting. The defense attacked her credibility and argued that prosecutors had not produced conclusive physical evidence placing Serafini inside the home. Serafini's wife, Erin Spohr, also testified. She continued to maintain that she did not believe her husband was responsible for the attack. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision. On July 14, 2025, Serafini was found guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and first-degree burglary, with additional special circumstances and firearm allegations found true. The man who had once stood on a baseball mound was now facing the consequences of a crime that had haunted his family for years. The exact motive became a major part of the case. The The prosecution argued that Serafini had a motive rooted in his troubled relationship with his in-laws and financial disputes. Wendy survived the attack and later changed her will, removing Serafini and her daughter Erin as beneficiaries. On February 27, 2026, Serafini was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, he offered no response when the verdict was announced.
The court hereby sentences you to life without the possibility of parole.
The judge rejected his request for a new trial, and his attorney said the defense planned to appeal. The sentencing brought Robert and Wendy's family face to face with the man convicted of destroying their lives. Their daughter, Adrienne Spohr, told reporters that her mother had fought to survive that night and refused to let the attack defeat her. She also spoke about the lasting emotional impact of losing both parents and said she had suffered severe fear and anxiety since the shooting. Outside the courthouse, Adrienne said Serafini had finally been held accountable and would spend the rest of his life behind bars. 4 years after the shooting, the courtroom finally delivered its punishment. But for Robert and Wendy's family, the sentence could never restore the life they had before that June night. The next killer vanished with the victim's disappearance itself, the last man seen with her, and the last person anyone suspected.
Nothing can undo what was done. Nothing can bring my daughter back.
A young mother was reported missing in August 2022, leaving behind a child who still asks where she is. 4 years later, the man last known to have seen her was convicted of her murder. On August 15, 2022, LaCambria Toomer was reported missing in Dougherty County, Georgia. She was a young mother, and Ryan Cooper, the father of her child, was the last person known to have seen her. What happened next became the center of a heartbreaking case. Toomer was killed inside Cooper's Audi, where forensic evidence consistent with her presence was found on the headliner, passenger seat cushion, and center console. Her remains were then concealed, but despite years of searching, she was never found. Authorities continued searching for Toomer and gathering evidence surrounding her disappearance. A crime scene expert testified that the evidence pattern was consistent with someone being shot while sitting in the passenger seat before falling across the center console. Investigators also found a hole in the passenger side door. DNA testing of suspected evidence found on the vehicle was consistent with Toomer's maternal family line. A medical legal consultant testified that the amount and location of the disturbing evidence supported the conclusion that Toomer suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head. But there was one major problem. Toomer's body was never found. The case remained unsolved for years. Then in March 2026, Cooper was formally indicted in connection with Toomer's death. He faced several charges, including malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime, and concealing the death of another person. Even after the case moved forward, investigators continued searching for Toomer's remains. The case finally reached trial in July 2026. On July 14th, after deliberating for just 24 minutes, the jury announced its decision.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
The verdict established Cooper's responsibility for Toomer's death, but it could not answer the question her family had been asking for years. The evidence presented at trial established how prosecutors connected Cooper to Toomer's killing, but her family was still left without the answer they wanted most: where her remains had been taken. Her mother, Malasia Thornton, wanted more than a conviction. She wanted to bring her daughter home and give her the final goodbye she deserved. On August 7, 2026, Ryan Cooper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict landed, but his expression never changed. Cooper's defense continued to maintain his innocence and was expected to seek a new trial. Meanwhile, the search for Toomer's remains continued. Before Cooper was sentenced, Toomer's mother faced him in court and pleaded with him to tell her where her daughter was. She also spoke about her grandson, Jordan, who's now being raised by his grandmother. The little boy still asks about his mother. He recognizes her pictures, gives them kisses and hugs, and asks people to help him find her. For Toomer's family, the conviction brought accountability, but it did not bring LaCambria back home. The next killer wasn't born from hate, he was born from fear, a scam, and a stranger who never should have been mistaken for the enemy.
We, the jury, being duly impaneled and sworn, do find the defendant, William Brock, guilty of the murder of Lalitha Hall.
An elderly man believed a stranger had come into his home as part of a scam, but the woman at his door was an Uber driver who had no idea she had walked into a dangerous misunderstanding. Moments later, 6 gunshots would turn a simple delivery into a deadly tragedy. In March 2024, 61-year-old Lolitha Tolland Hall, an Uber driver from Dublin, Ohio, accepted a delivery request. She had been caught up in the same scam targeting 83-year-old William J. Brock. Brock had received phone calls claiming that a relative needed $12,000 in supposed bond money. The scammers convinced him that someone was coming to his home as part of the scheme. Hall had also been deceived by the scammers. She was simply following the delivery instructions and arrived at Brock's home in South Charleston, between Dayton and Columbus, to pick up a package. But Brock believed she was involved. When Hall arrived, Brock confronted her while holding a weapon. She had no idea why he believed she was connected to the scam. Hall was unarmed and posed no threat. Then, without warning, the situation turned deadly. Brock raised his weapon and fired. 6 shots struck Hall. The Uber driver had arrived simply to complete a delivery. Instead, she became the victim and never made it home. Authorities began piecing together what had happened at Brock's property. The evidence showed that Hall had been caught in the same scam that had frightened Brock. She had unknowingly arrived at his home while he believed she was part of an attempt to take his money. Brock maintained that he had felt threatened and that he acted in self-defense. His defense argued that the scammer had made threats against him and his family, but Hall had not come armed. She was an Uber driver responding to a delivery request. The case went to trial, where Brock testified about what he believed was happening that day. The video showed Hall arriving at Brock's property and remaining inside her car for about 20 minutes. When she eventually stepped out, Brock confronted her with a gun. Hall began backing away and pleading for help. Prosecutors argued that this was the moment Brock should have stopped. Instead, they said, he continued advancing toward her. During a struggle, Hall managed to close her car door against Brock's head, causing injuries that later required stitches. Brock then fired additional shots and she died later during surgery at a Kettering hospital. Brock also called an emergency after the shooting. During the call played for the jury, he admitted that he was the shooter. In the background, Hall could be heard pleading for help. After hearing the testimony, watching the dashcam footage and considering Brock's self-defense claim, the jury rejected his account. On January 14, 2026, the jury found Brock guilty of 3 counts of murder, felonious assault, and kidnapping. They deliberated for roughly an hour. Brock believed he was protecting himself and his family from people who were trying to take his money. But when he saw someone outside his home, he believed the danger had finally come to his doorstep. He didn't know that Hall was not his enemy. She had been deceived by the very same criminals who had deceived Brock. A scam had unknowingly brought the 2 strangers together, and a tragic misunderstanding would end with Hall losing her life. After the guilty verdict, Brock was sentenced to 21 years in prison. The jury delivered the verdict, but he remained motionless and didn't say a word. 2 families were left dealing with the consequences of a crime that neither Brock nor Hall fully understood until it was too late.
Hall to pick up a package from Brock's Clark County home.
Lolitha Tolland Hall had gone to Brock's home doing what she believed was an ordinary Uber delivery. For Hall's loved ones, the hardest part was knowing how ordinary her final moments had seemed. She had simply accepted a delivery and gone to a stranger's home, never knowing that a scam had already created fear and suspicion around her. The next killer didn't need a weapon to lure his victim. All it took was a familiar face and an invitation she trusted.
Boyfriend of 17-year-old London Thomas, who disappeared in April of 2025 and whose body was found inside an SUV weeks later, has pleaded guilty to her murder.
A 17-year-old girl went to her ex-boyfriend's home and never came back. Days later, the search for her led to a sealed container inside a vehicle and a discovery that turned a missing person case into a murder case. On April 5, 2025, 17-year-old London Thomas was last seen alive at the Inkster home of her ex-boyfriend, 23-year-old Jalen Pendergrass. After London failed to return, she was reported missing, and concern quickly grew among those who knew her. Authorities continued piecing together what happened after London's disappearance. The search eventually led authorities to a vehicle in Southfield. Inside was a plastic storage bin containing London's body. The container had been sealed shut, concealing her from view. An autopsy later determined that London had died from asphyxiation. The discovery transformed a missing person case into a murder case, with London's final known location becoming a crucial part of the story. The case eventually centered on Pendergrass, who was identified as the person London had last been seen with. His mother Carla Pendergrass was also charged separately after authorities alleged that she had helped arrange for another person to move the container holding London's body. On July 2, 2026, Jalen Pendergrass pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in London's death. As part of a plea agreement, charges including felony murder, tampering with evidence, and unlawful imprisonment were dismissed. The reason London was killed remained a painful unanswered question for her family. What was known was that she had gone to the home of someone she had once had a relationship with and never returned. On July 31, 2026, Pendergrass was sentenced to life in prison. His mother's case continued separately, with her facing charges connected to the handling of London's remains. However, both remained silent through the verdict. For London's loved ones, the most painful part was knowing that a teenager who should have been coming home instead became the center of a search for answers. Someone from her loved one said,
"I am struggling to find words when there are none to express the feelings that I had, and I will have."
And when the case finally reached its turning point, the courtroom could provide a conviction, but it could never give London's family back the future she should have had. The next case proves two people can share a crime and still spend years blaming each other for who pulled it off.
The man accused of killing his elderly aunt is now in the hands of a jury. Craig Smith and his girlfriend Yvonne Jaramillo are accused of killing Josephine Ortega in 2017.
An 86-year-old woman was home when two people allegedly forced their way inside. 5 years later, the man accused of killing her finally faced a jury. In May 2017, 86-year-old Josephine Ortega was at home in Albuquerque when Craig Smith and Yvonne Jaramillo allegedly forced their way inside. They had entered the house looking for cash. At first, it was a robbery, but inside the home, everything changed. Ortega was confronted by the intruders and restrained with zip ties. Her hands were bound, taking away her ability to fight back or run for help. The elderly woman was now trapped inside her own home. The attack took a deadly turn. Ortega struggled to breathe until she suffocated and died. But one question remained. Why would Smith target his own aunt for money? But what happened next became a battle of two stories. One account placed Smith at the center of a planned robbery. The other pointed to Jaramillo as the person responsible for Ortega's death. As investigators began piecing together the crime scene, they discovered a cigarette butt on the back patio of Ortega's home. It became another piece of the investigation when DNA testing was conducted. Then investigators got another break. DNA recovered from a lipstick-stained cigarette stub pointed to Jaramillo. And the evidence became even harder to dismiss when Jaramillo herself admitted that she had smoked the cigarette found on Ortega's patio. Then surveillance footage captured Smith depositing $600 in cash into an ATM. The cameras also captured Smith and Jaramillo entering Ortega's home, placing both suspects at the scene. What began as a few seconds of surveillance footage was becoming a powerful link between Smith, the evidence, and the killing. The case remained unresolved for years before Smith eventually faced trial. Jaramillo had already been convicted for her role in the crime and received life in prison plus 15 years. 5 years after Ortega's death, the case against Smith finally reached the courtroom. In October 2022, Smith's trial began in Albuquerque. The central question was not whether Ortega had been killed during the home invasion, but who was responsible for her death. Prosecutors presented Walmart surveillance showing Smith and his girlfriend, Jaramillo, buying zip ties, gloves, wipes, and a flashlight about a week before the murder. The same type of zip ties were later found binding Ortega's hands. Jaramillo became the prosecution's key witness after pleading guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy. She testified that she waited outside while Smith entered Ortega's house. When he returned, carrying a bag filled with cash, she said Smith told her he had killed Ortega by suffocating her because he did not want neighbors to hear. The defense attacked Jaramillo's credibility, arguing that she was trying to reduce her own punishment by blaming Smith. His attorney pointed to evidence placing Jaramillo near the home and argued that there was no direct evidence proving Smith himself killed Ortega. But prosecutors argued that the evidence formed a clear chain: the preparation, the trip to Ortega's home, the stolen money, and Smith's own alleged admission. According to prosecutors, money was the motive. Smith knew Ortega kept nearly $100,000 in cash. That's why he planned the robbery at her home, to pay off a $50,000 substance debt. He allegedly went there intending to take cash, and the situation escalated into a deadly attack. Smith faced the consequences of the allegations 5 years after his aunt's death. while Jaramillo was already serving a life sentence, plus 15 years for her involvement.
Jaramillo was sentenced to life plus 15 years for her role in the murder.
The trial would ultimately force the courtroom to examine the roles each person played in the attack on an elderly woman inside her own home. For Ortega's family, no argument could change the fact that an elderly woman never got to return to the ordinary life she knew. Some victims were killed by people they trusted. Others were attacked inside places where they should have been safe. And for some families, even a conviction brought no closure. The courtroom delivered justice, but no sentence could undo the loss. And if you want even more content, join our membership for exclusive videos and early access to every upload. Your support helps us keep telling these stories. The join button's below, or scan the QR code on screen now. Thanks for watching.